Hey guys, tonight we are going to step into a world that you may find both shocking and unsettling, the world of experiments on corpses. These experiments, conducted by doctors and scientists of the past, were once viewed as necessary steps in the pursuit of medical knowledge. But as we delve into these practices, you'll quickly realize just how disturbing they were, especially when you consider how little regard there was for the dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Drop your location and time zone in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with one of the most unsettling aspects of early medical practice, the dissection of human bodies. In ancient times, doctors and researchers had very little understanding of the human body beyond what they could see and feel. For centuries, the study of anatomy was considered taboo, but as medicine progressed, more and more dissection of human remains became essential to advance knowledge. But here's the thing: access to human bodies was incredibly restricted. Back then, bodies were not readily available for dissection. So, how did doctors learn about human anatomy? The answer lies in one of the darkest aspects of early medical research: grave robbing. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a significant demand for corpses for dissection, and this demand was filled by the infamous group known as the Resurrection Men. These were individuals who would dig up graves and steal recently buried bodies to sell to medical schools and universities. The Resurrection Men were part of a grim underground market that supplied medical professionals with the cadavers they needed to teach students about human anatomy. The practice of grave robbing was widespread, and it was not just an isolated incident, it was institutionalized in many places. Medical schools depended on these stolen bodies to conduct dissections and teach students, making it a dark part of the medical education system. These corpses, often stolen from paupers' graves or people who couldn't afford a proper burial, became objects of study in the name of science. At the time, there were no clear laws protecting the dead, and family members had no recourse when their loved ones' bodies were desecrated. Resurrection men were rarely caught, and when they were, the legal consequences were often minimal. It wasn't until the Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed that the laws regarding body snatching began to tighten. But by then, the damage was done, and the practice had already scarred medical history. But grave robbing wasn't the only disturbing practice in medical research. Once the corpses were acquired, they were used for some of the most horrifying experiments imaginable. One of the most infamous examples of this is the use of corpses in early scientific experiments to study diseases, chemicals, and even surgical techniques. Researchers and doctors would perform experiments on the bodies, injecting them with various substances to study their effects. For instance, mercury was once used to treat syphilis, and doctors experimented with injecting mercury into the bodies of cadavers to see how it would interact with the tissue, though it was known to be toxic. Mercury was still used in experiments for a long time, and doctors didn't always fully understand the dangers they were exposing their subjects to. The bodies of the dead were often used to test these substances, with no regard for the harm they might cause. Another disgusting practice was the use of electrical experiments on cadavers. In the early 19th century, scientists like Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta were experimenting with electricity, and they began to apply electrical currents to dead bodies in an effort to understand the effects of electricity on the nervous system. The famous galvanic experiments led to the discovery of how muscles could contract when stimulated by electricity. While these discoveries were groundbreaking, the methods used applying electricity to freshly dead bodies were grotesque and lacked any understanding of the ethical concerns involved. In some cases, cadavers were subjected to electrical shocks in an attempt to reanimate them, as though the power of electricity could somehow bring the dead back to life. These experiments were done without any respect for the individual or the family's wishes, and the only goal was to unlock the mysteries of the human body. No matter the cost, The idea of bringing the dead back to life has fascinated humanity for centuries, but these early experiments on cadavers were, in hindsight, disturbing and inhumane. And then, there was trepanation, a practice that involved drilling holes in the skulls of dead bodies, and sometimes even living ones, in an attempt to treat various conditions. The belief was that opening the skull would release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain, especially for those suffering from mental illness or head injuries. This gruesome practice, though, wasn't just limited to the living. Researchers would experiment on the skulls of the deceased, using rudimentary tools to drill holes in hopes of discovering more about the brain and nervous system. Trepanation wasn't as uncommon as it might seem. It was practiced by various ancient cultures, and while it may have been intended to treat head injuries or mental disorders, it was also used to study the anatomy of the brain, even if it resulted in damaging the tissue or killing the subject. These ancient medical practices are evidence of how much people were willing to endure and to inflict on others in the pursuit of knowledge, despite the disturbing nature of these experiments. Medical knowledge did progress, albeit slowly and often at a high cost, in many cases. These early practices led to medical discoveries that helped shape the field of modern medicine. The dissection of human corpses led to a better understanding of anatomy, and the experiments on cadavers helped to refine surgical techniques and explore new ideas about disease and the body's functions. But even as these discoveries were made, the practices involved were far from ethical by today's standards. As you drift into sleep tonight, remember that while these practices were horrifying and unethical, they were a part of humanity's relentless pursuit of knowledge. The road to modern medicine has been long and filled with mistakes, but every misstep along the way has ultimately led to the healthcare systems we have today. It's a reminder that even the darkest periods of history have the potential to create a brighter future. As you drift deeper into sleep, let's continue our journey through this dark chapter of medical history. We've already explored the disturbing practice of grave robbing and the horrific experiments performed on cadavers. But the story doesn't end there. As unsettling as the history of corpse experimentation may seem, it's essential to understand how these practices, no matter how gruesome, contributed to the advancement of medical science in unexpected ways. We now know that science moves in fits and starts, with each failure and misstep teaching us a valuable lesson. Some of these horrifying medical practices were necessary to push the boundaries of knowledge, even if they came at the cost of human dignity and life. But let's look at how these corpses and their tragic use for science led to breakthroughs we rely on today. In the early 20th century, as the study of human anatomy began to deepen, new and more precise techniques were developed. The practice of dissecting cadavers was no longer the only method for exploring the human body. Instead, scientists began focusing on biopsy techniques and advanced imaging methods, both of which would ultimately replace some of the more brutal experiments of the past. X-rays, CT scans, and MRI technology emerged as non-invasive ways to study the human body. These breakthroughs have saved millions of lives, and their development can be traced back to the dismal practices of early researchers. Yet, even as these new methods were emerging, there were still horrifying remnants of the past. Formalin-fixed cadavers were still used in many medical schools well into the late 20th century for the purpose of training students in dissection, though no longer done with stolen bodies. It was a difficult reality to reconcile even in the modern age. The study of death remained a crucial part of medical education. One of the most harrowing aspects of early medical research was the complete disregard for informed consent. Back then, patients, if they were considered at all, had no say in how their bodies were used for research. The idea that someone's body could be used for medical purposes after their death, without any permission, was considered normal. It wasn't until the Nuremberg trials in the mid-20th century, in the wake of the Batipid, that a global conversation about medical ethics truly began. During the Nuremberg trials, The inhumane medical experiments carried out by Nazi doctors on prisoners of war were exposed to the world. These experiments included freezing tests, vivisection without anesthesia, and other grotesque procedures done on living subjects. The atrocities committed during this time led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical guidelines that became the foundation for medical ethics today. One of the most important aspects of this code was the concept of informed consent. The idea that any medical experiment, even posthumously, must be carried out with the full, explicit agreement of the subject. As society progressed, we began to see a shift from the morally questionable practices to more regulated, ethically sound practices. The focus of modern medicine today is not just about the quest for knowledge, but also about ensuring that the rights and dignity of individuals are respected in every step of the process. For example, in the U.S., the Belmont Report published in 1979 established the ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. It emphasized respect for persons, beneficence, doing good, and justice, which are still cornerstones of research ethics today. The impact of these guidelines has been profound, helping to shape the ethical framework that governs not just medical research, but also fields like psychology, sociology, and public health, even though we now have strong protections in place. It's important to remember how recent these ethical shifts have been. For much of history, the dead were treated as mere objects for study, and the living were often forced into experiments without their knowledge or consent. We cannot erase the horrors of the past, but we can honor the lessons learned from those who suffered in the name of medical advancement. In many ways, the modern world owes its respect for human life, autonomy, and dignity to those who came before us. It is their pain and suffering that laid the foundation for the ethical standards we follow today. And we must never forget the price they paid. As you begin to drift off to sleep, think about how far we've come from the dark days of grave robbing and unethical experiments. Modern medicine has given us the ability to heal, to cure, and to save lives, all while respecting the dignity of those involved. Every life is precious, and every step we take forward in science is built on the lessons of the past. These lessons are not just about medical discovery, they are about honoring humanity. Tonight, as you sleep, may you rest knowing that the pursuit of knowledge, though fraught with mistakes, continues to lead us toward a better, more compassionate future. The journey from darkness to light is never easy, but it is always worth it. As we settle into the rhythm of the night and allow the stories of the past to guide us into sleep, let's continue our journey through the unsettling practices that defined early medicine. Tonight's exploration is not just about the horrific experiments conducted on the dead, but also about the enduring impact those experiments have had on the world of modern medical science. In earlier centuries, many people believed that the road to medical progress was paved with trial and error, often at the expense of the human body. While we now know that the body is far more delicate than we once thought, back then, the boundaries between life and death were often blurred for the sake of scientific discovery. Cadavers became objects for dissection, experimentation, and even mutilation in an effort to better understand the complex system of the human body. And while these practices were barbaric, it's important to remember that the world of medicine was still in its infancy. One of the most unsettling aspects of these early practices was the complete lack of regulations. In today's world, medical professionals are governed by strict ethical codes and legal frameworks to ensure the safety and rights of patients. But back in the day, there were few, if any, checks and balances. In fact, medical experiments often occurred without informed consent or even the knowledge of the families involved. This disregard for basic ethical standards is one of the darkest chapters in medical history, and it is one that continues to shape the way we think about medicine today. The study of the human brain, the center of all thought, movement, and memory was one area that particularly lent itself to disturbing experimentation. In the 19th century, doctors and scientists were desperate to unlock the mysteries of the mind, and in their pursuit of knowledge, they turned to the most unsettling of practices, brain dissections. Corpses were often dissected to examine the brain, and in some cases, researchers would experiment on the living brain, without anesthesia or consideration for the well-being of the subject. Perhaps the most infamous of these experiments were the vivisections, or live dissections, which were carried out by doctors eager to explore the human nervous system. Imagine the terror of being strapped down to a table, fully conscious, while a doctor used sharp instruments to explore your innermost organs. It's chilling to think about how far we've come from those dark days. But these early practices were part of the foundation of modern neuroscience. As we continue to reflect on these horrors, we must acknowledge the bravery of those early scientists, whose drive for knowledge sometimes led them to make grave mistakes. Though the suffering they caused is undeniable, their pursuit of understanding ultimately pushed the boundaries of what we now know about the human body and mind. Modern neuroscience, with its incredible advancements in brain research, would not have been possible without the early, albeit deeply unethical, experiments that laid the groundwork. We also can't ignore the moral debate that these practices sparked during their time, though many of the medical community were complicit in these experiments. Some pioneering individuals began to question whether the ends truly justified the means. Some voices began to speak out against the brutality of these practices, calling for the protection of human life and the dignity of the dead. Slowly, as society began to move forward and as knowledge of human rights developed, the foundation of medical ethics began to take shape. The horrors of the past eventually led to the development of crucial medical laws that protected individuals from exploitation in the name of science. Yet, the story doesn't end there. Even though we now have informed consent, ethical guidelines, and sophisticated technologies, it's important to remember that these advancements didn't happen overnight. Modern medicine has been shaped by centuries of experimentation, some of which were deeply unsettling and unethical. The road from the disturbing practices of the past to the compassionate care we have today was paved with hard-earned lessons, and many lives were lost along the way. One of the most important lessons we can take from this history is the understanding that knowledge without compassion can be dangerous. While science has the power to transform lives, it must always be accompanied by empathy, respect, and ethics. The horrors of past medical experiments on corpses remind us of the importance of putting human dignity first, and ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge never comes at the expense of others' rights and well-being. As we conclude tonight's journey, take a moment to reflect on the progress we've made, from the ghastly practices of early medical research to the modern standards of medical care. We've come a long way, and while we can never erase the dark moments of history, we can learn from them, ensuring that we never repeat the same mistakes. As you settle into sleep, think about how far medicine has come. From bloodletting and gruesome experiments to life-saving treatments and ethical standards. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. The lessons of the past have shaped the world of medicine we know today, and each step forward has made the world a safer, healthier place for all. May your dreams be filled with the knowledge that we are constantly learning, growing, and evolving for the betterment of all humanity. As you settle in deeper, let's continue to unravel the long and tumultuous history of medical practices, where the line between science and morality was often blurred, from gruesome experiments on cadavers to the pursuit of life-saving knowledge. There is no question that these disturbing practices have had a lasting impact on modern medicine. But as we reflect on this dark history, it's vital to remember that every mistake, every horrific experiment, served as a crucial lesson in how we practice medicine today. The deeper we go into the past, the more we uncover about the extraordinary lengths doctors were willing to go to understand the human body and its complex systems. One of the most chilling examples of early experimentation involved electroshock therapy, though it was first used to treat mental illnesses. It was often done with little regard for the patient's well-being. Imagine, if you will, being strapped to a chair, fully conscious, as a jolt of electricity is administered to your body. This method was intended to treat various mental conditions, including depression, but the procedure was performed with very little understanding of its long-term effects. The shock would cause violent muscle contractions, and patients often experienced intense pain and disorientation. In the worst cases, it could cause brain damage or even death. The practice, though eventually refined and used with more care, was initially so poorly understood that it often left patients in a worse state than before. Despite its painful and dangerous beginnings, electroconvulsive therapy (ECT), though controversial, still exists in a modified form today. However, it's performed under strictly controlled conditions with anesthesia and muscle relaxants to ensure patient safety. What was once an excruciating and unregulated procedure has now become a treatment of last resort, used to help individuals with severe depression or other mental health disorders. But the experiments on living bodies didn't stop with electricity. Another disturbing practice that was common in the past involved tuberculosis testing on cadavers. Tuberculosis (TB), a deadly disease caused by bacteria, was rampant in the 18th and 19th centuries. Autopsies of those who had died from the disease were often performed in an effort to understand the disease's progression and how it affected the body. However, researchers weren't just performing basic dissection, they were injecting the bodies of deceased TB patients with bacteria to see how it spread. At the time, researchers had no idea that TB was a bacterial infection spread through the air. Instead, they thought it was linked to environmental factors like poor air quality or bad humors in the body. In their desperate search for answers, they subjected the bodies of the dead to cruel experiments, all while failing to understand the actual cause of the disease. The tragic irony is that it wasn't until much later, with the development of the germ theory of disease, that we finally understood how infections spread and how to prevent them. But not all disturbing practices involved death. Some dangerous medical experiments targeted vulnerable living populations, such as the mentally ill or impoverished individuals in the early 20th century. Lobotomies were considered a cure-all for mental health disorders. The idea was simple, albeit disturbing. Doctors believed that by cutting into the brain and severing certain connections between the frontal lobes, they could cure a variety of conditions. From schizophrenia to depression to violent behavior, the procedure was often done without anesthesia, and the patient's consciousness was sometimes barely acknowledged. Ice picks were used to break through the skull, and doctors would sever connections in the brain. The result was often disastrous. Patients who underwent lobotomies were left in a vegetative state, unable to care for themselves, or worse, completely mentally incapacitated, despite the devastating consequences. The procedure was widely performed in hospitals across the globe until it was finally deemed unethical in the 1950s. With the development of psychiatric medications that were far safer and more effective, lobotomy was not the only example of brutal psychiatric treatments. During the same period, shock therapy was widely used, often with little regard for the patient's mental state. In some cases, patients were subjected to hundreds of sessions, sometimes without the ability to consent or even understand the process. While shock therapy has been refined in modern times, the memories of its unregulated and terrifying past still linger. As medical ethics advanced, the brutal practices of the past were left behind, but their legacy remains in the lessons they taught us. Today, medical research and treatment are governed by strict ethical guidelines, and the use of human subjects in experiments requires informed consent. However, these rights were not always in place, and we owe much of the progress in medical ethics to the sacrifices of those who were subjected to horrific practices. By reflecting on these disturbing medical treatments, we can gain a greater understanding of how far we've come in the field of healthcare. Modern medicine is grounded in compassion, science, and respect for human life values that were often absent in the past. The journey from the unethical experiments on cadavers to the ethical standards we follow today is a reminder of the importance of learning from our mistakes and ensuring that human dignity is preserved in every step of scientific advancement. Tonight, as you drift into a peaceful sleep, think about how much humanity has grown. The horrifying treatments of the past helped us realize that medical knowledge must be balanced with humanity and ethics. The journey toward compassionate care was long and painful, but it ultimately led us to a place where science and compassion walk hand in hand, ensuring the well-being of all people. As we close this chapter of history, remember that every leap forward in medical science came with lessons learned the hard way. Let these lessons remind you of the importance of respecting human dignity, because the future of medicine is not just about what we can discover, but how we treat others along the way. As the night deepens, we continue our exploration of a darker chapter in the history of medical science. The practices we've discussed so far may seem like nightmares from a distant past, but they were real, and they were carried out in the pursuit of knowledge. Human experimentation, sometimes cruel, often inhumane, has been part of the scientific journey. And while we can never undo the damage done, we can learn from it. The moral failings of early medical research didn't just affect the dead, but also the living. As modern medicine emerged, it was often shaped by the voices of those who fought against unethical practices and abuses of power in medical institutions. This battle wasn't just about finding cures, but also about ensuring that human dignity would never again be trampled on for the sake of scientific discovery. One of the most appalling examples of living experimentation was the Tuskegee syphilis study. This study, conducted between 1932 and 1972, is one of the most infamous examples of medical racism and ethical failure in the United States. African American men who had syphilis were told they were receiving treatment for their condition. But in reality, they were left untreated so researchers could study the progression of the disease. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, these men were denied access to the drug, and they continued to suffer and die from the disease. The Tuskegee study continued for 40 years before it was exposed to the public, and by then, many of the men involved had died. The study led to outrage and an outcry over the violation of human rights, and it served as a pivotal turning point in the development of ethical guidelines for medical research. The exposure of the Tuskegee syphilis study had far-reaching consequences. It forced the medical community and society at large to reevaluate how vulnerable populations were treated in research. It led to the creation of more rigorous ethical standards, including the requirement for informed consent. It was a tragic chapter in American history, but it also sparked legal reforms and the establishment of regulations that protect patients and research subjects today. The study's aftermath has continued to affect the trust between African American communities and the healthcare system, showing just how damaging medical misconduct can be. However, the history of human experimentation doesn't end there. Even as ethical guidelines were developed and new laws were created, informed consent was still not universally applied. In fact, for many years, there were incidents where human subjects, often vulnerable or marginalized individuals, were used without proper consent or oversight. One such incident was the experiments done on prisoners. In the 20th century, as research expanded, the use of prisoners in medical experiments became commonplace. These inmates were often subjected to drug testing, surgical procedures, or other experiments that were not done for their benefit but for scientific curiosity. The prisoners were sometimes coerced into participating, or their consent was manipulated, as they had no real power to refuse. Many of these experiments were done under the assumption that because prisoners had been convicted of crimes, they lost their rights to autonomy and human dignity. These medical experiments on prisoners were a shocking violation of human rights, but they continued for decades. It wasn't until the 1970s that researchers started to question whether it was appropriate to use prisoners for experiments. Laws were passed to protect these individuals, and ethics committees began to demand that all research, no matter the subject, follow strict ethical guidelines. But the damage done to countless prisoners remains part of the dark history of medical research. As we continue to reflect on these events, it's essential to understand the deep moral lessons they teach us. The story of unethical medical experimentation, from grave robbing to coercive prison experiments, is not just about the abuse of power, it's about the need for constant vigilance in protecting human rights and ensuring that no person is used as a mere object of study. Medical research is about improving lives, not exploiting the vulnerable. The horrors of the past paved the way for the ethical practices we follow today. But the road was long and fraught with moral failings. Without the lessons learned from these tragedies, it's possible that modern medicine would still be tainted by the same mistakes. Thankfully, medical ethics have made great strides, and research today is conducted under strict guidelines, with respect for human dignity and consent at the forefront. Tonight, as you relax and drift deeper into sleep, think about the many advancements we've made in medicine, not just in knowledge, but in our respect for human rights. The horrors of the past have taught us valuable lessons, and it is through these lessons that we have created a medical system that, despite its flaws, prioritizes the safety and well-being of those it serves. We can take solace in knowing that these dark chapters of history have shaped a better future for healthcare, one in which each patient's voice is heard and their consent is honored. As you sleep, let the lessons of the past guide us forward, reminding us that the road to progress is paved with both triumphs and failures, each one making us wiser, kinder, and more determined to never repeat the mistakes of those who came before us. As we continue to reflect on the history of human experimentation, it's essential to understand that the path from unethical practices to ethical medical research wasn't a smooth one. The lessons learned from the dark chapters of the past serve as a crucial foundation for the healthcare system we have today. These lessons remind us of the dangers of unchecked scientific curiosity and the importance of protecting human rights in medical research. While some practices were done with the best intentions, others were downright inhumane, causing harm to those who were the most vulnerable. The treatment of soldiers during wartime offers another example of disturbing experimentation. During both World War I and World War II, soldiers became subjects of experiments to study the effects of chemical weapons, radiation exposure, and other life-threatening substances. Many of these experiments were carried out without consent, and the soldiers had little to no say in what was being done to them. In some cases, the military government considered it a necessary part of national security, justifying the experiments by claiming that understanding the effects of these substances would protect soldiers in future battles. One of the most horrifying experiments took place during World War II, where radiation exposure experiments were conducted on soldiers. Some were exposed to radioactive materials. Others were subjected to high doses of radiation to study its effects on the human body. The long-term consequences of these experiments were devastating. Many of the soldiers suffered from cancer, organ failure, and other debilitating illnesses, despite the suffering they endured. These soldiers were not told the full extent of the experiments being performed on them, and their consent was never sought. It wasn't until decades later that the full extent of these experiments came to light, and the veterans involved were left to live with the consequences. Radiation experiments were not confined to just soldiers. They were also carried out on civilians. The U.S. government conducted secret experiments on pregnant women, children, and even prisoners, exposing them to radiation without their consent. One of the most infamous cases involved a study that exposed pregnant women to radioactive iodine, with the belief that it would help in the fight against thyroid cancer. The results were tragic. Many of the women suffered from complications, and their children were born with serious health problems, including developmental delays and birth defects. At the time, these experiments were justified by the idea that they would ultimately contribute to scientific knowledge that would benefit the public. The reality, however, was that these experiments were carried out with no regard for the subject's well-being. These acts of government-sanctioned medical abuse led to public outrage and were a catalyst for the modern ethics of informed consent, which stresses that individual autonomy and human dignity must be prioritized in all forms of medical research. As we reflect on these horrifying practices, it's crucial to acknowledge how far we've come in the field of bioethics. Today, human experimentation is governed by a strict set of ethical guidelines, such as the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report. These documents outline the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, which ensure that the rights and welfare of research subjects are protected. We now understand that informed consent is not just a legal requirement, it's a moral obligation. However, the memory of these disturbing experiments lingers, reminding us that ethical boundaries in medicine must never be taken for granted. They must be actively preserved and enforced to prevent history from repeating itself. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the radiation experiments, and countless other unethical practices all served as painful lessons that we should never forget. One of the most enduring lessons from this era is the importance of transparency in medical research. Today, ethical guidelines mandate that researchers must provide clear and accessible information to research participants, ensuring they understand the potential risks and benefits of participating in a study. This emphasis on clarity and honesty is a direct response to the unethical practices of the past, where secrecy and manipulation were common in the medical field. Moreover, there has been a significant push for accountability in medical research. Today, research findings must be published in peer-reviewed journals, ensuring that the results of studies are transparent and subject to public scrutiny. This system of checks and balances helps prevent unethical research from being conducted and holds medical professionals accountable for their actions. As we draw near to the conclusion of tonight's journey, it's essential to reflect on the progress made from these disturbing practices to the compassionate care we have today. What began as a pursuit of knowledge, often at the expense of human lives, has evolved into a science that places the human at the center. Medical research is no longer conducted in secrecy, but with full transparency. Consent and respect for the dignity of every individual. Tonight, as you rest and drift off to sleep, remember that the history of medicine is not just a record of scientific discoveries, it is also a story of learning from past mistakes, of growth, and of respect for human life. While the experiments and abuses of the past cannot be undone, they have shaped the world of medicine in ways that ensure that we never repeat those mistakes. The path we walk today is paved with the lessons of the past, reminding us that ethical standards must always guide the pursuit of knowledge. May you find comfort in knowing that we have come a long way from the darkest days of medical experimentation. The road ahead may still have challenges, but we are stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than ever before as we continue our journey through the unsettling history of medical experimentation. Let's focus on the resilience of humanity in the face of such dark practices. While the history we've uncovered may leave us shuddering, it's essential to recognize that these atrocities were not the final word in medicine. Progress came, albeit slowly, and what seemed like hopeless mistakes led to the birth of more compassionate and ethical medical practices. By the time we reached the mid-20th century, the horrific lessons learned from the Tuskegee study, the radiation experiments, and the exploitation of vulnerable populations began to catalyze the change that shaped modern medicine. No longer would medical professionals be able to conduct experiments at will. Laws and regulations were created to ensure that research could only proceed with proper consent, respect, and accountability. The development of informed consent was one of the most critical turning points in medical ethics. Today, this concept is the foundation of modern research, ensuring that every patient, whether living or deceased, has the right to be fully informed about the risks and benefits of their participation in medical studies. But the origins of informed consent go back to the horrible abuses we've just discussed, where the voices of the vulnerable were silenced, and their bodies were subjected to unthinkable experiments in the name of progress. The end of the Nuremberg trials after World War II marked another key milestone in the evolution of medical ethics. The atrocities committed by Nazi doctors who performed horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners became the catalyst for a global reevaluation of how we conduct medical research. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, set forth guidelines for conducting ethical human experimentation, emphasizing the need for voluntary consent and safeguarding the well-being of participants. The world vowed to never allow such inhumane treatments to take place again. The Nuremberg Code was groundbreaking in ensuring that research subjects, be they civilians or military personnel, would have their rights protected. It became the foundation for the Geneva Conventions and inspired further ethical regulations, including the Declaration of Helsinki, which laid down standards for human rights and medical research that still govern international studies today. However, as we reflect on how far we've come, it's essential to recognize that the pursuit of scientific discovery remains a double-edged sword, even today. Some controversial practices and treatments still arise, and the lessons of the past must always serve as a reminder. It's easy to become complacent when we think we've learned everything we need to know. But the history of experimentation is proof that medicine must never become detached from human compassion. Modern ethical guidelines and the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, ensure that medical professionals and researchers follow strict ethical protocols. But the shadow of past abuses continues to cast a long shadow, reminding us of the cost of knowledge gained through exploitation. Each new development in medicine must come with constant vigilance to protect the rights and dignity of those involved in research. One of the most striking examples of modern-day ethical concerns is the ongoing debate about genetic engineering and cloning. While these advances have the potential to cure diseases, enhance the human condition, and prolong life, they also present ethical dilemmas regarding the manipulation of the human body and the potential for harm. The lessons of the past, where scientists once tampered with life without full understanding of the consequences, serve as a warning as we move forward. The ethical considerations around CRISPR technology and gene editing are reminiscent of the debates that arose after early medical abuses. Just as the world was forced to reconsider the ethics of experimenting on the dead, we must now confront the complexities of genetic manipulation. With great power comes great responsibility, and the mistakes of the past remind us that we must always consider the consequences before taking that leap. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, think about how these past horrors, though tragic, have shaped our understanding of what it means to be human. The journey from inhumane experimentation to compassionate care has been long, but it has brought us to a place where human dignity is at the center of every medical decision. Ethical standards are now a cornerstone of medical research, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The dark history of corpses as a research subject serves as a reminder that every breakthrough in science comes with moral responsibility. We've learned that medicine is not just about discovery, it's about respecting the people we are trying to help and ensuring that their well-being is always the priority. As you rest tonight, remember that the progress of medicine is intertwined with the values of compassion, ethics, and respect for life. The journey from the past to the present is long, and we can never forget the mistakes that led us to this point. But we can take comfort in knowing that the medical community has grown wiser and more compassionate, ensuring that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. As you continue to drift into a deeper state of relaxation, it's important to reflect on the legacy of these disturbing medical practices. Though the actions of the past were shocking and inhumane, they shaped the way modern science views ethical boundaries in research. The horrors of earlier medical experiments, from grave robbing to electrical shock therapy and radiation exposure, have left an indelible mark on the history of science. But in those shadows, we've also learned invaluable lessons that paved the way for more humane, compassionate, and ethical approaches in modern medicine. Through every tragedy, there was growth, and through every error, a deeper understanding of human rights emerged. The modern world of medical research is vastly different from the brutal practices we've uncovered tonight. Ethics, informed consent, and patient autonomy are now cornerstones of medical practice. And the mistakes of the past serve as a constant reminder of why we must never take human dignity for granted in today's world. Before any medical experiment or treatment can take place, rigorous ethical review ensures that everyone involved understands the risks and agrees to the process. Institutional Review Boards (IRBs) carefully scrutinize proposed research to ensure that human subjects are protected if the lessons of the past were lost. It is these protocols that protect modern medicine from returning to the days of exploitation and suffering. And yet, ethical concerns continue to arise, particularly in fields that push the boundaries of science, such as genetic editing, stem cell research, and artificial intelligence in many ways. The ethical conversations of today echo the debates of the past. In our quest for greater knowledge and longer life, we must ask, at what cost will our advances, while incredible, put us back on the slippery slope of ethical missteps? Take, for example, the controversial field of genetic editing. Tools like CRISPR allow scientists to modify DNA, potentially eradicating genetic diseases and improving human health in ways previously thought impossible. But the moral questions surrounding this technology are profound. If we can edit the genes of embryos, for example, how far can we go before we cross a line? Should we be able to create designer babies? Selecting traits like intelligence or physical appearance? Is it ethical to alter the very fabric of human nature? These are questions that modern science must grapple with. Just as early practitioners of medicine wrestled with their own discoveries in gruesome ways, the legacy of past medical abuses urges us to tread carefully. For every medical advance, there is an ethical responsibility that cannot be overlooked. The story of human experimentation is not just about horrific treatments. It's about the evolution of moral standards and human rights in science. And so, as we come to the final moments of tonight's reflection, let's take a step back and appreciate how far we've come. From the resurrection men of the past, who stole bodies to advance medical knowledge, to modern-day researchers who seek to cure diseases while preserving the rights of their subjects, we have grown. We've learned from the mistakes of the past, and the medical field now operates under a set of guiding principles that prioritize the dignity and safety of individuals. The pursuit of knowledge will always have its challenges, and scientific discovery will continue to advance. But with those advancements come ethical obligations. Obligations to protect the most vulnerable, to respect human life, and to always ensure that science is used for good. The horrors of the past have shown us what happens when these obligations are ignored. But they also remind us of the importance of compassion in every step we take toward the future. As you relax, think about the progress we've made in terms of medicine, ethics, and human rights. The road has been long, and it has been marked by mistakes. But each of those mistakes has ultimately led us to a better, more compassionate world of medical care. The lessons learned from the past have shaped the medical field we know today, where every person's dignity is respected and every treatment is grounded in respect. Science and humanity. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the echoes of those lessons fill your dreams. The horrors of the past have shaped us, but they don't define us. We are better because we've learned, and tomorrow will always be a step closer to a more compassionate, ethical future. As the night deepens, we approach the final stretch of this journey through the shadows of medical history. The story of experiments on corpses, unethical practices, and human suffering is one that serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of ethics in science and medicine. But even as we face these uncomfortable truths, we can't forget the profound impact that these lessons have had on shaping the compassionate and ethically guided medical practices we have today. Every step forward in the world of medicine was built upon the mistakes of the past. The horrifying practices of grave robbing, invasive surgeries, and unethical experiments on living and dead bodies were once considered necessary for advancing knowledge. Yet, as history has unfolded, we've realized that knowledge without compassion is not true progress. We've already talked about how modern ethics and medical research were shaped by the unethical practices of the past. The stories of those who suffered during these dark times, whether grave robbers, research subjects, or patients, have all played an integral role in helping to establish the ethical guidelines that protect us today. One of the most important lessons we've learned is the necessity of informed consent. Informed consent is now the gold standard in medical research and treatment. But in the past, the concept of asking for permission was rarely considered, especially when dealing with the dead. The resurrection men of the 18th and 19th centuries, who stole bodies for dissection, never asked for consent from the deceased or their families. And, unfortunately, even in cases where living patients were used in experiments, many didn't fully understand what was being done to them. They were often manipulated or coerced, with little regard for their rights as individuals. The advent of modern medical ethics can be directly linked to the exploitation and abuses of the past. It was through witnessing the harmful consequences of these unregulated practices that society and the medical community demanded more stringent protections for individuals participating in research. We now recognize that no scientific discovery is worth the sacrifice of human dignity. Our ethics, laws, and guidelines today serve to honor the memory of those who suffered in the name of science, ensuring their pain was not in vain. Yet, even as we celebrate how far we've come, there are still difficult questions that modern science must face. As technology continues to advance, ethical challenges arise. Take, for example, the rise of biotechnology and genetic engineering. As we push the boundaries of science to eliminate disease and improve human life, we must ask ourselves, how far should we go? What are the risks, and most importantly, who has the right to make these decisions? The ethical dilemmas surrounding gene editing technologies like CRISPR bring us face to face with similar moral questions that were posed by past medical experiments. While these advances hold the potential to cure genetic diseases, they also raise concerns about the potential for designer babies, genetic inequality, and the manipulation of human nature. What happens when we begin to alter the very DNA that makes us who we are? These are the questions that medical professionals, scientists, and ethicists must continue to grapple with. The lessons of the past remind us to tread carefully and to ensure that all advancements are pursued with the utmost respect for human rights. We must never forget the importance of informed consent and human dignity, no matter how promising the science may seem. The road from unethical experiments on corpses to modern medical practices has been long and fraught with moral failings. But as we conclude tonight's journey, let's remember that the history of medicine isn't just a tale of progress. It's a tale of learning from mistakes, from the inhumane treatments of the past to the ethical research of today. Each step forward has been made possible by the painful lessons of yesterday. In a way, the horrifying experiments on corpses and living patients are reminders of how fragile the line is between scientific curiosity and human compassion. We've learned that it is not enough to simply advance knowledge. It's essential that we do so with the respect and dignity that every human life deserves. So, as you relax and close your eyes tonight, think about the progress we've made. Think about how the horrors of the past have helped shape a future where science and ethics walk hand in hand. The ethical standards we have today are the direct result of the sacrifices of those who came before us, and their suffering has made the world a better place. Tonight, let's rest easy knowing that science and compassion can coexist. The journey from exploitation to respect was hard-earned, but it has made our world a better place. As the night stretches on and the quiet sets in, let's take a moment to reflect on the journey we've taken through history. We've uncovered the disturbing medical practices of the past experiments on corpses, the abuse of the vulnerable, and the ways in which human lives were treated as mere objects for scientific discovery. These are the stories that shaped modern medicine, but they are not the full story. The lessons learned from these horrors have led us to a world where ethics and human rights are paramount. The road from the dark experiments of the past to today's ethical standards has been long, and the transition was not an easy one. But it is essential to recognize that progress, whether in science, medicine, or ethics, requires constant vigilance. Modern medicine is no longer dominated by experimentation on the dead or the exploitation of the living. Today, it stands on the principles of respect, dignity, and informed consent. The lasting impact of the medical atrocities we've explored is a reminder that medicine is not just about knowledge. It's about how we treat each other. The story of medical ethics is ultimately about humanity, how we balance the pursuit of scientific discovery with the responsibility we have toward those we study, whether alive or deceased. The history of medicine is filled with mistakes, but it is also filled with the courage to change and grow. In the wake of past abuses, medicine has learned to embrace compassion and transparency. Today, we have the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and countless other guidelines to ensure that research is conducted ethically and with respect for human dignity. The suffering of past generations has led to laws that now protect the vulnerable from exploitation. But the past is not just a place for us to look back and learn, it is also a place for us to remember. Memory is one of our most powerful tools for ensuring that we do not repeat the mistakes of history. The stories of gruesome experiments, grave robbers, and unethical medical practices remind us of our shared responsibility to honor those who came before us and to uphold the standards of ethics in science today. Even as we sleep, we are connected to the past. The advancements in modern medicine that save lives today were made possible by those who dared to question the unethical practices of their time. In many ways, their suffering and their willingness to stand up against exploitation has shaped the compassionate care we benefit from today. In this quiet moment, as you settle into a peaceful slumber, consider the lessons we've learned from human suffering and medical abuse. The mistakes of the past led us to the creation of ethical principles that guide research and healthcare today. And while these mistakes should never be forgotten, we must continue to move forward, ensuring that respect for life, human dignity, and compassion are always at the forefront of scientific inquiry. The road to where we are today was paved with the pain and sacrifices of those who were exploited for the sake of medical progress. Their stories are the reason we now have the right to refuse unethical treatment, the right to know what will happen to our bodies, and the right to be respected as human beings. As we wrap up tonight's story, let's hold on to this. The evolution of medical ethics isn't just about what we know, it's about how we use that knowledge to honor and protect every individual. The horrors of the past were essential in creating the ethical standards that guide us today. Each mistake and each tragedy paved the way for a future where medicine is used to heal, not to harm. Tonight, rest easy knowing that ethics and human dignity are the backbone of modern medicine. We are not simply the products of the past, but are shaped by our ability to learn from it and ensure that we never repeat its darkest chapters. As you drift off into sleep, let the thought of a better, kinder world of medicine bring you comfort, because through reflection and responsibility, we have created a future where compassion is as important as knowledge